Barakata Yahweh, Barakata Yahawashi, Bahasham, Rakaha Kudash, Barakatum. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahawashi. Double honors to the apostles and elders, a great millstone who rule and teach well. In peace and salutations to you sincere Akim out there, pushing this word in truth and sincerity to the four corners of the globe. May you brothers endure until the end. This is the brother Ra'aya with another video, and I'm going to start it off in Mark chapter 3, verses 24 to 25, and this is in red letters, so it's Yahawashi Hamashiach, whom the world ignorantly refers to as so-called Jesus Christ, speaking. And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And it should be pretty self-evident at this point that the house and kingdoms of Esau, Edom, the so-called white man, are divided, especially in the United States of America. Just about every conversation that could be had out here between your average everyday Edomites could easily lead into some type of argument or confrontation, from the political divide with conservatives against liberals, from the generational divide between baby boomers and Generation X, the millennials, or Generation Z, men against women with feminism versus MGTOW, from religious against atheistic Edomites, so-called straight Edomites against Edomites in the alphabet group beginning with LG, your average Joe Edomites against Edomites in the government, class divisions with the lower and middle class against the upper classes, etc., etc. And this is ultimately going to culminate with violence in the streets. There will be civil unrest and a form of a second civil war in the United States of America. And in this video, I'll be reading from two articles to show that with each passing day, we're getting closer and closer to just all hell breaking loose. And besides just ideological differences between the people, and you've got situations out here which are just going to further exacerbate the tensions. Look at what's going on with the supply chain disruptions, Salakia. Look at what's going on with the supply chain disruptions, which is leading to shortages in these stores. Hey, these shortages are going to lead to people getting desperate out here when they see that they can't get their hands on what's available. So they're going to start fighting each other for whatever's left, which I did a video on the other week. And then also with the Crack-a-Muffin 19 situation going on and the mandates that are getting pushed, that's going to further divide people. Those that are for it going against those that are against it. And then also up in the Carolinas, you've got the U.S. government training to fight against so-called domestic terrorist, extremist, and militia movements in the government. Hey, the writing's on the wall that something big is in the making. But the first article I'll be reading from is on endoftheamericandream.com titled Political Collapse. Are we witnessing the beginning of the end for the divided states of America? And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And that's exactly what you're seeing, the end of the United States of America, which biblically is known as Babylon the Great, as well as spiritual Sodom and Egypt, as pursuant to Revelation 11, verse 8. And if you look at a map of the country with blue states versus red states, it almost looks like a 50-50 split. How can a nation survive if there is absolutely nothing that binds the people together? In the early days, the United States was bound together by a common culture, the Christian faith, and the values enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. But today, that is no longer true. The left has a totally different culture than the right does, and both sides of the political spectrum have pretty much abandoned the values that were once held so dear by our founders. And if a house be divided against itself, how can it stand? Without anything to unite us, how can the divided states of America continue to exist as a cohesive political entity? And the answer is it won't. It's going to continue to deteriorate until those 200 million nuclear missiles hit this place and turn it into the biblical lake of fire from sea to shining sea, and then a desolate, uninhabitable wasteland afterwards. If you ask most Republicans to name the number one threat to our country, most of them will tell you that it is the Democrats. And if you ask most Democrats to name the number one threat to our country, most of them will tell you that it is the Republicans. Let me give you just one example. The following comes from a piece by a very liberal author that attempted to argue that the modern Republican Party represents a fundamental threat to American democracy. The battle to preserve American democracy is not symmetrical. One party, the GOP, now poses itself as an anti-majoritarian and anti-democratic, and it has become a party less focused on traditional policy values and more on tribal affiliation and resentments. A few figures, including Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney, know that this is a recipe for an authoritarian party, but there is no sign of what is required to reverse the most worrying trends, a broad-based effort among Republican leaders to stand up and join Democrats and independents in a coalition based on a reassertion of democratic values. Of course, many conservatives have written similar articles about Democrats. And if you see, it's a lot of these blue states out here that are heavily pushing these Cragamuffin 19 mandates, and people are getting arrested, like in places like New York, for not wanting to follow after them. Hey, both sides, Republican or Democrat, they're both rotten parties. And these politicians on both sides don't care about the average person out here. They rub shoulders with the elites and are on board with the agenda, so they're only covering their own asses and the asses of their loved ones, which is also leading to a house of Esau Edom being divided. Like I just said, average Joe Edomites against Edomites in the government. And don't be surprised when you start seeing political attacks and assassinations on these politicians out here by these different militia groups and networks hidden around. I did an article a while ago showing how an increase in rhetoric, in violent rhetoric towards American politicians has been steadily increasing over the past couple of years. And with the recent year, it's reached its highest level in a long time. We have gotten to a point where both sides of the political spectrum deeply, deeply hate one another, and that is a very dangerous place to be. Let me see. Yeah, I'm going to skip this part right here and just get to the meat of the matter. On a national level, after what we have seen in recent years, nobody will ever be able to have faith in our elections ever again, because elections were always a fraud and a joke. Presidents aren't elected, they're selected to fit whatever agenda the elites have at the time. Democrats rioted and questioned the results when Trump won in 2016, and Republicans got extremely angry when Biden was declared the winner in 2020. At the rate we are going, I am not completely convinced that we will even have a national election in 2024. And Albaratazah, that's the case. Hey, it's looking like this place isn't going to make it to 2024. Salakia. But without a doubt, I believe that a whole lot of civil unrest is on the way. And you better bet your bottom dollar on it. When activists on the left riot, they usually only get a slap on the wrist, if they are even charged. Of course, when conservatives get rowdy, law enforcement comes down on them extremely hard. And there are many on the left that are quite eager to take things to the next level. For example, former Deputy Director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, wants to treat rowdy conservatives like Islamic terrorists. McCabe likened conservatives to members of the Islamic Caliphate. I can tell you from my perspective of spending a lot of time focused on the radicalization of international terrorists and Islamic extremists, and extremists of all stripes, is that this group shares many of the same characteristics of those groups that we've seen radicalized along entirely different ideological lines, he said. McCabe went on to describe the rise of the Islamic Caliphate in Syria and how Islamic extremists were radicalized across socioeconomic, educational, and racial lines, likening it to the mass radicalization of the political right across demographics. That's right, according to McCabe, a grandma who shares a Federalist article on Facebook, and your uncle with a Let's Go Brandon coffee mug are in the same category as a jihadist who killed 49 people at an Orlando nightclub. And what are the majority of conservatives? They identify as so-called white Christians. And just look at the history of so-called white Christians who founded the United States of America. Some of the most vicious, violent, bloody terrorists out here. How did they get this country? Breaking into it, illegally taking the lands of the so-called Native Americans who were the Gadites and the Roomadites of the Northern Kingdom, and enslaving the Southern Kingdom by bringing them over here, putting people under reservations, rape, robbing, and murdering. The list goes on and on. Hey, these Democratic or liberal Edomites are bad, and you conservative or Republican Edomites are no better. But why stop there? A new bill in the state of Washington is setting up a framework that would allow government officials to detain troublemakers and take them to Q-Dog zones. You know, by now we have to speak in codes with these videos. Washington state appears poised to enact a bill that would use a strike force to involuntarily detain those who still refuse to obey and comply with the ruling class. Straight up force and an enhanced police state could be used to force people into Q-Dog zones in the near future. WAC 246-100-040, and I did a video on this on my Odyssey account. A proposed revision to include Cragamuffin Protocol under the state's Communicable and Certain Other Disease Act outlines procedures for isolation or quarantine, according to a report by the Gateway Pundit. The measure would allow local health officials at his or her sole discretion to issue an emergency detention order causing a person or groups of persons to be immediately detained for purposes of isolation or Q-dogging. And like I said earlier, in the Carolinas, you've got the government doing drills to combat potential future attacks from so-called domestic terrorist, extremist, or militia groups. And as this bill just said, local health officials at his or her sole discretion could issue an emergency detention order. So with these different militia groups out here or anything like that, they could simply label it as a health emergency and get those people's names and say, look, we've done everything we can to get them to follow after the mandates. They're not doing it. So send out the authorities at gunpoint to round them up and throw them into these Q-Dog zones. Health officers are required to provide documentation proving unjungle-juiced residents subject to detention have denied requests for medical examination, testing, treatment, counseling, jamba juicing, decontamination of persons or animals, isolation, Q-dogging, and inspection and closure of facilities. And what group out here is majorly against these Cragamuffin mandates and the Jamba Juice? Those that identify as conservatives, Republicans, libertarians, you name it. Also, the groups that are most into these militia and so-called anti-government and pro-freedom activities. Prior to involuntary confinement in Q-Dog facilities, the resolution states, so basically, if you simply want to live as a free human being, you are going to be free to only obey the dictates of your masters. This situation has taken our national divisions to an entirely new level. Many on the left have lost all tolerance for those who are unwilling to submit to their demands, and many on the right have lost all tolerance for those that are relentlessly trampling on our freedoms. So, how can we possibly live together after everything that has transpired? And where do we go from here? Violence and death in the streets of the United States of America. Like I said earlier, there will come a point to where there will be civil unrest in a form of a second civil war on the streets of the United States of America, in whatever form it may take. You may literally have states going against each other, sending in the National Guard to states like Texas or Florida that don't want to get along with the national crack-a-muffin mandates. Average Joes out here conducting targeted strike attacks on political figures or facilities, or just average Joes out here fighting each other because the store shelves are empty and they got to get their hands on whatever's left. I was at the park the other day, and these two Edomites, a man and a woman that looked to be about in their 40s, I was walking by them and just happened to overhear their conversation. And the woman said, "You're hearing so much about a second civil war in the United States of America. And you know what? With everything that's going on, I believe that it's going to happen." Hey, that's just the average conversations out here. And with us having the scriptures and an understanding of them, we know that's exactly what's going to happen. This is Isaiah chapter 19, verse 2. "And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians," the modern day spiritual Egyptians. These Edomites are so-called white people. Like I said, besides being known as Babylon the Great in the scriptures, the United States of America is also known as spiritual Edom, spiritual Sodom, and Egypt, as pursuant to Revelation 11, verse 8. "And they shall fight, everyone against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. If a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand." And as we read from my first article, hey, the tensions are getting thicker than a German guard dog out there. And eventually this pot's going to boil over, and there will be violence in the streets of the United States of America. And with my next article I'm going to go to, you can see that more and more Americans are getting behind that idea. This is an article from nypost.com titled, "34% of Americans say violence against government is justified." And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians. "A third of Americans say violence against the government is sometimes justified," a shocking new poll revealed on Saturday. The percentage of people with that view compared to previous years increased significantly. According to the poll published by the Washington Post University of Maryland survey, the results, which come almost a year after a violent mob of former President Donald Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol, found that 40% of Republicans agreed it could sometimes be justified for citizens to take violent action against the government. 23% of Democrats and 41% of independents also endorsed the situation of violence. And like I've also been saying throughout the video, this house and kingdom of Esau, Edom being divided against itself, and these Egyptians fighting against these other Egyptians isn't just these average everyday Edomites on the streets going against each other. It's an average Joe Edomite going against these Edomites in the government. And like I also said, I did a video a while ago showing that violent rhetoric towards U.S. government politicians has risen to its highest level over the past couple of years. And this plays in the 2nd Esdras, chapter 15 in the Apocrypha. I'm going to start at verse 14. "Woe to the world and them that dwell therein, for the sword and their destruction draweth nigh, and one people shall stand up and fight against another. I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, brother against brother, city against city, kingdom against kingdom, and swords in their hands." And that modern day sword, especially in the United States of America, is that gun. "For there shall be sedition among men." And when you look up the definition for the word sedition, it reads conduct or speech inciting open rebellion against a ruling authority or monarch and invading one another. "They shall not regard their kings nor princes." And your modern day kings and princes are these political figures in the government. Your mayors, senators, governors, presidents, prime ministers, etc., as well as the authorities that uphold the system, like the police, National Guard, regular military, you name it. And like I've been saying, up in the Carolinas, the government has been doing drills to fight against homegrown domestic terrorist, extremist, or militia groups. They know these things are coming, so they're preparing accordingly. And the course of their actions shall stand in their power. And with that sedition among men and not regarding their kings or princes, that fits perfectly with the last sentence we read in that article. Where is it at? The results, which come almost a year after a violent mob of former President Donald Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol, found that 40% of Republicans agreed it could sometimes be justified for citizens to take violent action against the government. They shall not regard their kings nor princes, but there shall be sedition among men. 23% of Democrats and 41% of independents also endorsed situational violence. Of those who agree that rising up in arms, one people shall fight against another with swords in their hands against the government could be acceptable, 22% said it would be justified for invasions of personal liberties, while 15% pointed to a military takeover or democratic collapse. 3% said violence was appropriate if the government did not accept election results. The numbers had risen sharply in recent years, just like the numbers dealing with an increase in violent political rhetoric and threats towards politicians. In 2015, 23% of Americans approved of violence against authorities, researchers said. 5 years before that, 16% agreed, up from 13% in the mid-90s, said with this article. As we can clearly see, biblical prophecy is taking place before our very eyes, and the stage is being set for these Egyptians to rise against Egyptian and fight against each other violently on the streets of the United States of America. So that's it with this video. And with this video, I hope you sincere Akim were edified. Just keep strong and keep pushing this word. We're almost out of this final wicked captivity of the heathen nations, chiefly of the Edomites. And as always, I'm going to say Abad Babal, Kwam Yasharala, and until next time, Shalom.